and this opportunity to be gathered together to sing, to worship you, to read your word, encourage each other, and to learn from history. And I pray once again that you would bless Dan with strength and energy to teach us. Pray that you would strengthen his voice and his throat, and also, just help us as an audience to listen and have open hearts and minds as we learn about our spiritual and physical forefathers. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, and good evening to each of you who came. And maybe there are also people who are watching on the live stream. If you are, good evening to you as well. It's good to be here again. Last night, for those of you who were here as a way of bringing back to remembrance, and those who weren't, if any of you were not and didn't watch it on the live stream, last night I talked a little bit about the process of time when the Anabaptists in Europe, some of them, made the trip across the Atlantic Ocean to America. And the destination that many of them had was Pennsylvania, which was an English colony, operated, actually sort of owned by William Penn, who was a Quaker, and who invited them to come, among other people, to live here in harmony with, ideally in harmony with everyone, and in that promise of a place to live, going beyond simply the toleration that some places in Europe were granting to Anabaptists. Here it was more a sense of liberty to live, to do the livelihood that you wanted, which most of them were farmers, and more importantly, the liberty to worship God and to live as disciples of Jesus as they understood it from the New Testament, from Jesus' example, from the writings of the apostles. Were allowed to live their faith freely. And I talked a little bit about how the process of time led the Anabaptists here. Some of them eventually used the name Mennonites, and others Amish, which was sort of a division that had its roots in Europe. But both varieties were able to establish prosperous communities, prosperous farms. Some of them weren't farmers, but many of them were. And as time went by, they worked hard, and another generation or two, relatively wealthy, and beginning to be viewed as good citizens of the states in which they resided, and also that they spread out into other states as well in the somewhat in the mid to late 1700s, and then even more in the early to mid 1800s. So that's what we looked at last night, and I said that that at the end of that sort of era, which I'm going to say is roughly the 150 years from about 1700 to about 1850, I won't say the eve of the Civil War, which started in 1861, we have the Anabaptists being welcomed as citizens in the United States of America, but also still doing their best, I believe, to be citizens of the kingdom of God. And sometimes those two citizenships came into conflict. And I suggested that that this is not a kind of unique thing. That challenges and choices come into our lives, and our sense of citizenship can be tested. What I'd like to start with tonight is just a verse, and you don't need to turn to it. It's just one verse. It's in Acts chapter 4, and if we look at the account in Acts chapter 4, we will find, just in a real summary here, we find a setting where Peter and John, going to the temple to pray after Jesus' ascension, were asked by a lame man for alms, for money, probably money. And Peter and John, instead of giving the man money, gave him the use of his legs. It was a miraculous healing, and it was very astounding, and it drew attention to them. And Peter used the opportunity of this attention to point out, and it wasn't Peter and John who healed this man, it was the power of Jesus, who is the Messiah. And he points out that this is the man whom the chief priests had rejected and had in fact arranged for him to be crucified, but he had risen and had given power to his followers. Wow. The leadership in Jerusalem there did not like to hear this message being proclaimed in the temple. And they kind of, I guess we'd say, they arrested Peter and John at this point. And they said, we find here in verse 18, that they told Peter and John he commanded them not to speak at all or teach in the name of Jesus. And now this is the verse I want to highlight. But Peter and John answered and said unto them, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you more than unto God, judge ye. Now, I'll paraphrase that. What they said is, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to listen to God, you be the judge. Now, that's a rhetorical question. Of course, the leaders there would have had to state publicly, if they actually wanted to answer, oh, well, you have to obey God. That's more important than anything else. And Peter and John are going then to say that Jesus commanded us to teach in his name. And by implication, your command not to do it is of less importance than what God himself commanded us through Jesus. So they couldn't obey them both. And if you read on in the book of Acts, they didn't obey those authorities, and sure enough, a little later, they're in trouble again, and they say the same sort of thing. And that well-known verse, as it's rendered in the King James, says, we ought to obey God rather than men. Life throws us challenges, and we have to make choices about who we're going to obey. Sometimes it becomes clear to us that we can't obey both what we're being told by some men or some authorities or some people, and at the same time continue to obey God. And that's the setting that the Mennonites and Amish people found themselves in occasionally in America in the time period after and during the immigration period that we looked at last night. So tonight I'd like to start by thinking about how this citizenship comes under test. And on one hand, this is the citizenship of being seen as an honorable, upright, good citizen of, say, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or whatever state eventually they happen to be in, or it's the citizenship in the kingdom of God. And we'll see what some of the challenges were and some of the choices that the people had to make. Where's your loyalty? During the time of revolutionary America, it was difficult to tell. Many of us, growing up probably, had education that taught us about the founding of our country. And in general terms, That's a factual, presentation of the events that led to what we call the American Revolution. And, of course, we're looking at it several hundred years later. It may seem like, well, it was just bound to happen. It wasn't that big of a deal, and it was a good and proper thing. I have a feeling many of us would feel, without maybe giving it a lot of thought, that it was a good and proper thing for the colonists to shake off the rule of the king, and that the English, the king and the people working for him weren't really that good, and so it was right and proper to do this. That's what it might look like 200 some years later to us. It's not what it looked like to the people who had to live through it. It was confusing. I don't know about you, but since March or April of 2020, I've often been confused as to which authority I really need to obey. Because I get all kinds of messages coming out of Harrisburg, Washington, about what you should do or what you have to do in relation to dealing with the pandemic. And it's confusing sometimes to know. And I work, I no longer teach school, and I haven't for a number of years now at Terry Hill there, but I work for Goods Store. I serve as the marketing manager for Goods Store. And so this became a thing of some matter of confusion and trying to find a way. How, as a business, how do we try to honor all of these things? Because it seems like some of the authorities say one thing and some say another. As confusing as that was, it didn't land anyone that I know of, certainly nobody in my circle of acquaintances, didn't land anybody in jail. It didn't land anybody a fine, and it certainly didn't land anybody in any sort of real predicament, but it was different in the period where we turned from colonial to revolutionary times. So I want to tell you a little bit about that tonight, and talk a little bit also about some other later events. But I will say, just before we go any further, that in the history of our people in America, the times that have usually led to the most significant challenges with the government have been times of warfare. Of all the things that we live and believe and teach and strive to follow Jesus on, our refusal to take up arms and work to defeat our enemies by force is one issue that comes up repeatedly in our country's history. Every major warfare that had occurred, it has created challenges for people who want to take Jesus' word seriously about loving their enemies. And so this is true in the time of the American Revolution, which was a time of warfare. It was true during the Civil War. It was true in the wars of the 1900s, the World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War. Since then, we haven't had wars that have involved drafting men to serve. And so a lot of the pressure hasn't been as significant in the wars since then. But during those wars, it has been a challenge. And some of you, maybe some of you, may either be old enough to remember at least some of that era, or maybe some of you have parents who do, and you can talk with your dad or your mom and learn about what it was like during maybe one of those periods of conflict where there was a draft in effect and so on. Well, let's go back to the 1700s here. In fact, we'll go back to 1775 and 1776. Look a little bit at non-resistance in a time of war. Pennsylvania was a kind of unique colony. It did not have a militia. I said last night that in America they never had standing armies. They never had peacetime armies, and that was true. There was an expectation, though, in many of the colonies that able-bodied men would practice and drill and become a little acquainted with a little bit of military strategy so that in a time of need they could defend their villages, their towns, their cities, maybe even their colony. And also, to some degree, maybe help the real soldiers from England if a war did happen, which occasionally did, especially the so-called French and Indian War, which was almost 10 years of fighting. But the militia's main job was in part to keep the peace, in part to be available to maybe repel the attacks of American Indians more than another country's soldiers. Pennsylvania never had one. It didn't have a militia. Why not? Well, William Penn was a Quaker, and Quakers did not believe in taking up the sword any more than Anabaptists did. And so William Penn said, we don't need a militia because we're going to live at peace with everybody. And in Penn's lifetime, that was true. William Penn died around 1718, and he handed the colony off to his sons. Now, his sons, unlike him, did not stay in the Quaker faith. William Penn had converted from the Church of England to be a Quaker. His sons converted back. They went back to the Church of England and took their church membership there. But he didn't change their policy because in Pennsylvania, they didn't live here much. They came over a little bit periodically. The proprietors of the colony, as they were called, did not live here. Instead, they sent a governor over who was to work with his assembly of people. And for many, many years, the assembly was elected by the male landowners, and the male landowners were mostly Quakers. So the assembly was mostly Quakers. And even during the worst time for that, in the French and Indian War, the Quakers said, we don't want a militia. We don't want to fight the American Indians and the French. We want to have good relations. And they actually made efforts to try to have peace talks with some of the American Indian tribes, and ultimately that wasn't successful. And the people living on the frontier who bore the brunt of the fighting became very, very hostile to the Quaker-led government in Pennsylvania. Down in Philadelphia, they said, the people down in Philadelphia, they're safe. They don't know what it's like out here on the frontier. They don't have to worry about American Indians attacking. And so there's a lot of tension, and it became kind of a political issue then after the war was over. You know, part of it said, you guys didn't support us when we needed you. But at the end of the day, there was still no militia here. Every other colony had one. I should rephrase that, possibly with the exception of Delaware. Delaware had been part of Pennsylvania until 1702, when William Penn granted it a separate assembly, and he may have had the same policy there. So, but we'll just say for sure, Pennsylvania was pretty unique in that regard. So when the American Revolution begins to unfold in the 1760s, as the war ended with the French and Indians, then we have tax problems, okay? And I'm not here to give you a lesson in American history. You probably remember that dimly back in the recesses of your mind, or maybe it's something that you recently went to school for. You remember all about the Boston Tea Party and maybe the Stamp Act and those kinds of things, and the Continental Congress. You know what? For most of our German-speaking Mennonite and Amish forebears, I have a feeling that whole thing just missed them completely. People in Boston, they'd never been to Boston. People in New York, probably never, ever really in New York. Philadelphia, they knew. They probably heard a little something about this Continental Congress, but it was probably a thing that the English people were worried about, not the German people. So I have a feeling that by 1775, when we actually have warfare erupting between these people who call themselves things like patriots or Whigs, who are defending their rights against the ruler of England and King George and the army that he sends over. Keep in mind that that was a party of American, English-speaking Americans. It was by no means all of them. Maybe it was a half at best. And in the early times, it was probably less. I have a feeling that a lot of the Mennonites and Amish people didn't really pay much attention to it. But when the war started, then it became real. So Pennsylvania did not have a militia. And even in the context of an armed fight going on in 1775 in Massachusetts, and also there was some fighting in Virginia, there wasn't any actual fighting in Pennsylvania in 1775. even in that context, and the Quakers were kind of being sidelined by the events. Most of them were loyalists to the king anyway. The Pennsylvania Assembly, which was kind of ruling almost in place of William Penn's sons by this time, even in that context, they said, we don't want a full-fledged militia. They called it an association. And they said every able-bodied man ought to associate together for the defense of this colony. However, there was not a requirement to serve. And so, if you didn't want to serve in this militia, voluntary militia called the association, you had to pay a tax. They were using English currency, and so it doesn't really translate much to our currency today. The tax was set eventually at £3 10 shillings. I've tried and tried to figure out how much that was worth in today's terms, and it's just really difficult historically to know how much it was worth in Pennsylvania. You know, you kind of know what it would have been worth in England, but prices in the colonies were not always the same as in the home country. £3 10 shillings. I have a feeling that if we looked at that in our terminology today, that maybe it would be seen as, I don't know, maybe $1,000. All right? It was a substantial sum of money on one hand, but it was affordable enough on another that people who didn't want to associate could pay it and get out of it. That was good for a year. It was like you had to pay this every year, and then you didn't have to associate. And by and large, Mennonites and Amish did not associate with this. They paid the fine. In some of the townships in Lancaster County, there were more people who were paying the fine than were joining the militia, which was rather upsetting to the people in Lancaster who were kind of aligned with this revolution. And there was certainly some hostility towards all these people who weren't participating like they should. But the law said they had the right to pay a fine, and they did. But in the context of that, there was concern among some of the church leaders that they need to somehow explain themselves to the Pennsylvania Assembly, which was, like I said, was pretty much running the show at this point. The Penn brothers hadn't even been here when the thing started. They were in England. Their governor had left. And so by the late part of 1775, the real leadership was the Pennsylvania Assembly, and they had created what they called an executive council, which I think had 3 members, and it kind of rotated. But there was a 3-member committee that kind of was calling the shots. So in November, the oldest and longest-serving Mennonite church leader in Lancaster County, who was called Bence Hershey, seems likely his real name was Benedict, but I've also read it as Benjamin, but his nickname was Bence. Bence Hershey, who'd been living here for maybe 35 or 40 years. He's a rather old man at this point. Wrote a declaration to the Pennsylvania Assembly explaining the non-resistance of the Mennonites. And it becomes known as the Short and Sincere Declaration because that's what its heading says. A short and sincere declaration. Actually, do I have it with me here? It isn't very long. Even today, on typewritten, it's 1 page. But yeah, it starts out, a short and sincere declaration to our honorable assembly. So that historians call it that. And in the context of this, this is what he writes, okay, he didn't write it. He got an English scribe to write it. He, of course, being a German speaker, probably had a very, very poor grasp of the English language. But this is what the scribe wrote. The advice to those who do not find freedom of conscience to take up arms, that they ought to be helpful to those who are in need, we receive with all cheerfulness toward all men of what station they may be, it being our principle to feed the hungry and give the thirsty drink. We have dedicated ourselves to serve all men in everything, that can be helpful to the preservation of men's lives, but we find no freedom in giving or doing or assisting in anything by which men's lives are destroyed or hurt. Now, what he talks about there at the beginning, that they ought to be helpful to those in need, supposedly that money that they were paying as the extra tax to get out of association membership was to help the families of the men who were in the association. And so he said, we are willing to help people in need. That's one of our principles, all right? We want to help the people in need. And we want to do anything we can to help preserve men's lives, but we're not free in our conscience to destroy people. Okay, and it goes on to say some other things, and he pointed out that they are willing to pay taxes and to be subject to the higher powers in accordance to the Scripture's commands. And then he says, though, that he can, not quite the conclusion, but near the end he writes this, or had this written on his behalf: we are not at liberty in conscience to take up arms to conquer our enemies, but rather to pray to God, who has power in heaven and earth, for us and them. And so what he's saying here is that we cannot take up arms to fight. Well, the assembly actually respected that position, and it seems like they kind of from there on it was never required for the Anabaptists in Pennsylvania to serve. They did have to continue paying that fine, though, on an annual basis. So there were actually many more groups than Mennonites. The Amish did not take up arms, neither did the Quakers, at least the ones who were still living according to their faith. A lot of the Moravians did not want to fight in those days. The German Baptists that today we call the Church of the Brethren, there were some of them, and there were some smaller groups as well. So it wasn't as if it was just Mennonites and Amish, but it does seem like that's a large portion of the people who were saying, we will pay, but we won't take up arms. It really wasn't until, okay, now let me say one more thing. In 1776, in July 4th, we have the Declaration of Independence. And so at that point, this colony of Pennsylvania formally says, we're the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a free and independent state. Okay? Initially, the United States wasn't seen as sort of like one country, but a collection of countries bound together in their effort to become free of English rule, and there were 13 of them, and Pennsylvania was one. So at that point, the Assembly kind of rewrote the Constitution, issued a new one eventually, and people started electing a governor who was sort of the leader, and so on. That happens in the middle of 1776. Fighting doesn't really come to Pennsylvania till 1777, when the British moved an army from New York down to Philadelphia to try to, they captured the city and put the Continental Congress on the run. George Washington tried to intervene and fought a battle called the Battle of Germantown. Take it back. It was the Battle of the Brandywine, in an attempt to prevent the British from entering Philadelphia. That was fought in Chester County. And then the Battle of Germantown, an attempt to drive them out, both of which were failures for George Washington's army. They wintered at Valley Forge. Many of you perhaps have been there to the park. Well, that all is taking place in 1777 and 1778. Direct warfare never came to Lancaster County. Chester County, yes. And the Anabaptists who lived in Chester County, and counties to the east of that yet, which would be like Montgomery County particularly, I guess, where Germantown was, they had to live through war. There were military campaigns, there were battles fought. and all of that. Lancaster County was spared that because the British never moved much out of Philadelphia, and eventually they abandoned the city and went back to New York, but that's down the road in 1778. Lancaster County, though, did have wounded soldiers being sent there to try to, if possible, recover from their injuries. For example, the effort at Cloister, which had been started in the 1730s, sort of an offshoot of what we would today call the Brethren. Conrad Beisel, and who was no longer living at the time, but his successor, Peter Miller, was. They became sort of a hospital for wounded soldiers from both Washington's Continental Army and, to some degree, the Pennsylvania militia, which were doing military engagements in the Philadelphia area. So they were sent out. Because there were so many people coming there, they drew in the whole Ephrata community, which had kind of grown up around the Cloister area. And one of the stories there is about the Mennonite minister from the congregation closest there named John Bear, and his wife Anna helped in the work of caring for soldiers. Some think they may have gone to the Cloister's buildings. Some think they may have even had to take soldiers into their own farmhouse. At any rate, somehow, from treating these men who were sick, they themselves got ill from the soldiers, and both died. And that sort of thing, I guess, happened. They also were housing prisoners of war from the British Army in the city of Lancaster in the jail. And sort of an interesting story that emerged just a few years ago from somebody who was doing some research in some of the archives in Lancaster. Apparently, in 1782, these 16 people were charged with helping 3 British prisoners of war to escape to New York City, where the British Army was at that point. And it seems like there was a sort of almost underground railroad, if you will. No, I guess we shouldn't call it that because this is long before railroads. What should we call it? I don't know. An underground stagecoach, maybe. The prisoners of war would escape, and they had this network of people in the county and across Pennsylvania then that would get them to their army headquarters again. You might think, well, that couldn't have happened. I thought all the Americans were angry at the British. No, not nearly. All right, a lot of them didn't care that much, and a lot of them were loyalists. But these 16 people were put on trial for helping these prisoners escape, and the reason it became known is that one of the people who noticed that prisoners were escaping was an American who then somehow pretended that he was a British prisoner of war, and he got himself included in a group that was trying to break away. And they actually didn't get away because eventually he turned them in to the authorities. But he was checking out who helps these people. And when he got the whole thing wrapped up, he went back to the city of Lancaster and said, these are the people that helped to give these men food and water, supplies. These gave them shelter through the day so they could move at night. I don't know, maybe they gave them other things too. Based on the last names of these people, it is believed that all of them were Mennonites. Groves we would probably render as Groff today, and it gets pretty close. Those last 2 names there, Christian and Barbara Zimmerman, are direct ancestors of mine. My Zimmerman ancestors came in 1733. Hans and Christian, brothers in their upper teens, made that voyage across the Atlantic, like we talked about, and settled in the Weaverland Valley. And Christian Zimmerman here, I believe, is the 2nd generation. I believe it's Hans's son. At any rate, he was a well-to-do farmer and got caught in this. Some of them were not found guilty. And some of them were, and interestingly enough, they were only given fines. They were not imprisoned, much less being executed for treason or something. But they did have some fines to pay. And their argument was that they were simply trying to help people in need. And they really weren't taking sides in this conflict. That people came to them and they needed food and they needed lodging, and they just gave it to them because they would do that to anybody. And that apparently convinced the authorities enough that they didn't punish them harshly. You did decide an appropriate thing would be a fine. In 1777, the Pennsylvania Assembly made life even more difficult for these Anabaptists. They passed a law that's usually called the Test Act. It was an act that required all male residents in Pennsylvania to attest to their loyalty to the revolutionary government of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And if they did not take this test or this attestation, they faced some pretty significant penalties. Now, they phased it in. They said you don't have to do it right away, but by 1778, you have to do it. And first of all, if you don't take this test of loyalty, number one, you lose the privilege of voting. Number two, you lose legal standing in Pennsylvania courts, which means, for example, you couldn't buy or sell land, you couldn't draw up a will, presumably you couldn't get a marriage license because you don't have legal standing in their courts. Thirdly, there was supposed to be an inability to travel outside of the municipality in which you resided, which would be the township. Then also double or triple taxes, somewhat at the discretion of the local leaders. And finally, if you were asked to take this test, this affirmation of loyalty, and you refused, you would be, these other things would happen, and they would repeatedly ask you. And if after 3 times you still wouldn't take that test of allegiance, then the sentence was that you would be banished from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with all your goods confiscated. Now, this only affected men because in colonial times only men could vote, and men were seen as the heads of their household. So the ladies did not have to take this test. And they intended for most of the men to take an oath, but they did understand, because of the Quaker influence again, that it wasn't an issue. If you didn't take oaths ever, you could say, well, I solemnly affirm my allegiance to, and that would be okay. Very few Mennonites, I'm sorry, I got the wrong button. Here we go. Very few Mennonites and Amish men would take the test. Why not? Well, number one, they said that they had come here as Germans to an English colony. And so to do that, to get in, to be a sort of a resident here, they had to make a pledge of loyalty to the king, because that was the government then. So they said, we can't go back on our word. We promised the British ruler when we came here to be loyal subjects, and we can't now take that back. That would be telling a lie, and we don't lie. It's sinful to lie. It would be false witness, I guess we might say. To say now, okay, after all, I'm not loyal to the king anymore. I'll be loyal to the Commonwealth. The other part of it is that there does seem to be a general attitude of loyalism among most of the Mennonites and Amish. They were content with the way things were. They did not see the king as a bad guy. They saw the Penns as good guys, in fact. And they also said, we know what Paul says in the book of Romans. As they would have read it in German, as we think of it in English, what does Paul say? Well, he says that the powers that be are ordained of God. So we need to obey. It says in there that we need to pay taxes or tribute for conscience sake. So all this whole argument that the king can't charge us taxes is kind of irrelevant to Christians, because Christians are commanded to pay taxes. There's no grounds for an argument really there. It's not nice paying taxes. None of us probably enjoy it, but we understand that it's just something we need to do. And they felt the same way then. And so due to this refusal to really side with the revolution, evidence suggests Mennonite men were imprisoned in Lancaster and in Reading. In some other areas, we do have a record that in Salkin Township in Northampton County, which was more of an outlying area north of Montgomery, where there were some Mennonites living, no Amish in that section, there were 10 Mennonite men, in fact, who did have the sentence of banishment and their goods confiscated. It's not clear that they actually were banished. In fact, it seems likely they weren't. But they did have all their goods confiscated by the Commonwealth and auctioned off to the highest bidder by the sheriff of the township in 1778. In fact, in some cases, we know that for some of the families there, because it's sort of an interesting story, two of the men who had this happen to them, last names were Bachman and Yoder. And presumably they were put in prison preliminary to being fully banished. And we have a document then that their wives got a local English person to write up an appeal to the assembly saying, this is what happened to our husbands, and our families are, almost destitute now. We don't have, all of our property was taken, and we don't even have beds to sleep in, and it's getting towards the fall, and it'll soon be winter, and please do something for us. And the Pennsylvania Assembly actually, in light of that petition, did. In fact, they revoked all of those conditions, except for you can't vote and you pay double taxes. Those conditions went forward, but they did, and they may even have compensated those families to some degree for their losses. That's not entirely clear, but it does seem like the men were not actually banished, but they did do that. So, quite a challenge, a choice to make, and that's the choice they did make, and it was a difficult time. There's not any significant evidence I've read that suggests that it went quite that far in counties like Lancaster and Chester, where there were more Anabaptists, and for that matter, more Quakers who wouldn't take it either. But it did happen in some places in our Commonwealth. In 1790, a new constitution revoked the Test Act, and at that point, the double taxes and the loss of the right to vote finally went away. Just as a little side note, you've all read in history class, right? No taxation without representation, that classic slogan. Well, for more than 10 years, Mennonite men who wouldn't take the test for conscientious grounds were not permitted to vote, but they were assessed double taxes. They weren't represented, but they were taxed. Now let's step forward. So that whole thing goes through, and I'm not here to say somehow that our forebears were they were responding to the challenges. They accepted the fact that the United States became independent. Okay, and most of them did not move away. There were some who moved to Ontario shortly after, and it may have been because they were still a little suspicious of where this whole thing could go in this revolutionary time. And in Ontario, they're under the King's rule. It was still a colony there. At any rate, after the United States became an independent country, Mennonites and Amish settled, as we talked about that last night, moved to other states, things like that. The next real test comes during the time of the Civil War. Were there wars before then? Yes, there were. There was the War of 1812, significantly. There was a Mexican War. And there were also repeated frontier conflicts with American Indian tribes. But the main thing that's different is none of those wars involved drafting people to serve. And also none of them really involved Pennsylvania, which would have still been the state with the most Amish and Mennonites. The Civil War, though, is quite different. So the Civil War begins in 1861 when a number of southern states declared that they were leaving the Union. And not to tell that whole story, I'm sure we're familiar with it. For the first time in 1862, we have drafts, conscription laws, which Anabaptists had fled Europe to get away from. They were used here on both sides. Some of the U.S. States did it, and also some of the Confederate states did it. When the federal government in the United States side, or the northern side, or the Union side, whatever you want to call it, when they would tell the states, you have to provide so many soldiers. If you can get the soldiers by volunteers, great. If you can't, you have to draft them. And so as time went by, the draft laws were put in place. Generally speaking, the way those laws were written, if you were a man of a certain age, you were eligible to serve. And then your name was put into a sort of a collection, and they would randomly draw names from your township or your town. If you were selected, you could get out of serving in one of two ways. In most of the states, you could pay your way out. It was a lot of money, but it was something you could do if you were wealthier. Or the other thing was you could arrange for a substitute to serve in your place. That was also legal. In 1863, the Congress passed a national draft law with a similar thing, saying if you don't want to serve, you can pay $300. $300 in 1863 would probably be like at least $10,000 today, maybe more. Okay, maybe who knows? I don't know, but it was a substantial sum of money, but it was out of the reach of the average person, although some people did pay it. But there again, you could also hire or arrange for a substitute. So the conscription laws that were passed usually allowed people to get out of being conscripted if they could pay or find a substitute. Locally here, our representative from Lancaster in Washington, our U.S. Representative Thaddeus Stevens, was a very firm and effective supporter of exemption. And the interesting thing is, as they revised that law several times, in 1863 and then again 1864, he always, because he was on the committee that wrote the law, he always put in a clause that allowed people for conscientious reasons to be able to pay the fine. All right? And he enjoyed solid Mennonite political support. As when he was running for re-election in 1864, there are at least stories that suggest that he even approached or was approached by Mennonite bishops saying, if you can keep our men from the ability to pay their way out, we will vote for you. And whether that's entirely true or not, he did win the elections, and he did do that. So if you were a person of a Mennonite or Amish church member and you were of age, you could be exempted. Here's an exemption card, for example, from 1862. The hiring of substitutes was a bit of a poser for a lot of Mennonites and Amish. Mennonites did do it sometimes, and so did Amish occasionally, although it seems to be less common with them. It raised a lot of questions, and it caused a lot of uneasy consciences. If you say it's wrong to take up your arms and fight, you say that it's wrong. It's not what Jesus wants. And if I want to follow Jesus, I can't do it. But what about the neighbor boy? He doesn't think that way. Maybe he's not really a Christian at all. Or maybe he says, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, but my church doesn't say that. My preacher doesn't say that. I go to the Lutheran church, or I go to the Methodist church, and They're not saying that. I would go. If you pay me, I'll go. Would you take them up? Or would you say, no, it's not right for you to do it either? It was a real poser. And sometimes Mennonites paid. Sometimes Amish people paid as well and got that substitute. And sometimes they decided not to, and they tried to come up with the money to buy themselves out. Keep in mind, that was a one-time out. If your name was drawn a second time, you had to pay the fine, or not the fine, the money a second time, but I don't know that happened very often. Eventually, as the war went on, the draftable age kept getting lower and lower, and eventually it was down to 18, and that led to this issue then as well. A lot of Amish-raised and Mennonite-raised young men were not yet joining the church at age 18. They typically did that a little closer to the time they got married, which was usually in the early 20s. And so they weren't technically members. Well, the law said if you're a member of the Mennonite or an Amish church, you can get out. You can pay your way out. It's not a problem. But they went to some of the leaders, went to Thaddeus Stevens, and he said, well, if they're not church members, I can't help them. It's just that was the best I could do was church members can have out. So in settings like this, sometimes they did hire a substitute. Some of the men fled to Canada to avoid serving, and some just went and served in the army. The difficult time, and interestingly enough, it did not produce a lot of solid statements of non-resistance like some of the earlier and later wars did. The Sonnenberg congregation in Ohio did write a statement, and they sent it to the governor of Ohio, where they said, we, they mean Mennonites here, we condemn all rebellion and insurrection against the government as resistance against the ordinance of God. We deem it as our duty to obey the laws of our country and to support our government by all means in our power as far as our conscience will allow. There are things in which we must obey God more than men. To do military service conflicts with our confession of faith. And so that was sort of serving notice to the governor of Ohio that they were not willing to serve in the military from that state. Also, here a little more locally, a man named Daniel Musser, who was part of a sort of small conservative splinter group of Lancaster Mennonites called themselves, or still do, I guess, still very few left, called the Reformed Mennonites, wrote a sort of a pamphlet called Non-Resistance Asserted, and came out in 1864. What we would call the two-kingdom concept is enunciated here. The full title, in fact, is Non-Resistance Asserted, or The Kingdom of Christ and the Kingdom of this World Separated, and no concord between Christ and Belial. And so his argument here is that there are kingdoms in this world, but there is a kingdom of Christ. All right? And really, if you're following and a citizen of the kingdom of Christ, you're separate from the kingdoms of this world, and you don't get involved in that kingdom and its wars and other things. Mennonites and Amish in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana maybe seldom had much direct connection to fighting. Right? The Union forces defended the territories well, and the Confederates never did much of an invasion. You did have the one from Pennsylvania, right, that culminated in Gettysburg in 1863. And there were Mennonites in that area who you know, to some degree experienced that military invasion. For the Mennonites in Virginia, it was very different, though. They were part of a state that left the Union, although part of Virginia then left Virginia and rejoined the Union as a state called West Virginia, which complicated matters a bit for some people. But for the Virginia Mennonites, they didn't live in that part. So they lived mostly in the Shenandoah Valley. And so they were kind of in the middle of everything. And one of the leaders there was Samuel Kaufman. When the war started in 1861, he was a minister. Then in the context, another year or so, he was ordained bishop for the Middle District of the Virginia Mennonite Conference in Rockingham County. These Mennonites in Virginia, writing things down in Virginia, had always taken a stand as a church against slavery. That really wasn't an issue for them. They didn't believe in slavery, and that issue, which led to the whole war. But they tended to side with the Union, and initially the Mennonite men were ordered to join the Virginia militia, but they did get an exemption eventually if they paid $500 as a fine. Sometimes they got pushed into it anyway. And there is a little bit of evidence that I've read that suggests that the Mennonite men who were forced into the army often turned out to be very, very bad soldiers, meaning they refused to fire their guns. And that some of the Confederate officers eventually realized that if they want anything out of these men, they can't send them into battle. They could make them drive wagons and haul supplies around or something like that, but they would just not really work as soldiers because they would refuse to fight. A lot of them, some of the young men attempted to flee the state to avoid getting pressed into the army. Some of them were captured and put in prison for doing that. Samuel Kaufman openly promoted non-resistance as a minister and then as a bishop to his congregation and to others in his area. His public commitment to non-resistance aroused the anger of some of the local military officers, and one of them threatened to force Kaufman and the other men in his church into the military in spite of their refusal. And Kaufman eventually got word that there were people that were so angry at him for saying that his congregation shouldn't fight that they were threatening to kill him. So in May, he traveled across the lines to Pennsylvania for safety and didn't return home until July. When things were, till late June, until things were sort of quieting down. Through several years of warfare, things got worse and worse. And in 1864, the Union forces ravaged the Shenandoah Valley in an effort to demoralize the Confederacy. And since this is where most of the Mennonites lived, a lot of them lost their farms. For the most part, they did not lose more than their farms. Their houses and other things were permitted, but the orders of the Union officers in charge was that everything of sustenance should be destroyed. So they burned the barns, they burned the mills, they burned the fences even sometimes, and they burned off all the crops, and they rounded up as much livestock as they could or slaughtered what they couldn't take, so that hopefully the Confederate Army couldn't use anything there to live on. That faced with that level of devastation, a lot of Mennonites and other people, as soon as they could, just left the area and found a new place to live. It was very difficult for the Virginia Mennonites to decide how they were to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. All right, what do you do when your state leaders say we're seceding from the Union and the president of the country says, but you can't do that? Very, very difficult. So to bring this to conclusion and sort of to where we're at today, this raises a question, I guess, for us to ponder, and that's our ultimate citizenship. Ultimate means to the last degree. At the end of the day, when you boil it all down, where is your citizenship? Okay, that's what I mean here by ultimate. At the end of it all, is it to the United States of America? All right, I assume that all of us here are citizens of this country because we've been born here. It's automatic. We're citizens of the United States of America. Or is our ultimate citizenship to the kingdom of God? Is it to Jesus Christ? We're born citizens of the U.S. We're born again as citizens in the kingdom of God. And if Jesus is our king, is that going to sometimes conflict with what the president and Congress or the governors say we need to do? And that's the question I'd like us to sort of think through. As hopefully the stories and things I've talked about tonight can help us understand that our forebears had to think that through sometimes. To which authority do we pledge allegiance? Okay? Is it to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands? Or is it to the cross of Christ? To which of these is our ultimate citizenship? When push comes to shove, who are we going to obey? Thankfully, a lot of the time, we're not asked to do things by the government that would violate Christ's commands. But it does happen sometimes. And for our forebears, it happened often in the context of wars, and that may happen to us at some point. We aren't promised that we'll have a lifetime where our country isn't at war. It may come in smaller areas too, where the government has laws that say, you need to do this. And we say, but we can't. It's a challenge. Maybe we'll face it more than we expect. I don't know. But it's worth thinking about. In the 1770s and 80s, in the 1860s, our forebears recognized that tension, that conflict. They couldn't obey both. And thankfully, many of them chose to follow Jesus in spite of the cost. And I think to me it's a sobering reflection, and also it's sort of inspiring that it's possible to do that. If they did it, I'm going to do it too by the grace of God. Thank you very much for your attention tonight, and I will turn it over to the moderator.